Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Maya Goldenberg, who is Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Guelph. Maya works in a topic at the intersection of philosophy of medicine and philosophy of science, as well as bioethics. She has an interest in the relation between science and values. She is the author of the extremely influential and beautifully written book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science. And today, Maya will be talking about myth-busting and meaning-making, public science communications, and the infodemic.
All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's talk. Today, we're very happy to have Maya Goldenberg here to give an ALS lecture. Before we launch into that, I have a couple of announcements for next week. On Tuesday, the 27th at noon, we're going to have a center debate. This one will feature a cage match between Nicholas Shea and John Krakauer on representation in neuroscience. It is an online event that you are welcome to join through the center website. There's also a lunchtime talk on Friday, March 1, by Arnon Levy, who was here. Oh, there you are, right in front. No cage match for Arnon. His talk is on understanding first view of explanation, both in person and online. Today's speaker is Maya Goldenberg. She's an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Guelph. She earned her bachelor's degree at the University of Toronto and then a PhD at Michigan State University. Her specialty is philosophy of medicine, philosophy of science. Most notably, she wrote a great book called Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, published, of course, by the University of Pittsburgh Press, as all great books are. And today, we're looking forward to hearing more sort of in this vein, but a little bit slightly different about public science communication in the infodemic.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Thank you for the invitation to share my work with the here at the University of Pittsburgh. So this talk is about public science communications, and that means science communications directed at the public. There are many aims of science communications, but the aim of public science communications is usually to improve public understanding of science and also to promote public engagement with science. So I'm going to be talking about two approaches to science communications today. One, myth busting, the other is meaning making, as well as the cultural narratives that underlie and justify these two approaches. I'm going to suggest in the end that meaning making is a preferred approach to science communications. Here is the general outline of my talk. I'm first going to situate us in the infodemic. The infodemic, you've heard that term before. It captures current thinking about the communications landscape, the challenging communications landscape that we're in. The infodemic is part of a broader cultural narrative of information disarray. I'm calling it the disinformation order. I didn't make up that term, but I will describe it. And that narrative of information disarray, of the disinformation order, justifies a very popular approach to science communications to the public called myth busting. I'm going to be challenging both that narrative and myth busting as an effective approach to science communications and suggest a different, an alternative cultural narrative that I gave it a very wordy name, the public's demand for participation in meaning making, and I will unpack that and make sense of it. And that cultural narrative lends itself to an approach or a strategy to science communications that we can call meaning making. Okay, so beginning with the infodemic, I'm sure you've heard this term before. It is often called the parallel pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic. The term infodemic, that portmanteau of information and pandemic, was around prior to COVID, but it really caught on at the start of COVID when the term was used by the director of the WHO. He said in February 2020, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than this coronavirus and is just as dangerous. So that term caught on. It's certainly a catchy phrase. And with it, what also caught on was a sense of urgency regarding the problem that the term is trying to identify. So the infodemic is now widely recognized not only as a parallel pandemic, but as a significant challenge for science communications. We would all like to know what is the best way to respond to misinformation persuasively during periods of heightened fear and fast-changing science. So I've already mentioned that the urgency of the infodemic, or the sense of urgency that attaches to that term, is because it fits into a broad cultural narrative, a narrative of mis and disinformation that has been called, at least by some theorists, the disinformation order. So I'm going to recount that narrative for you. It should sound very familiar because I'm sure you've heard it many times. I'm going to describe it and then I'm going to problematize it. So the narrative usually begins with the state of public trust now versus what it was like before COVID. There is a lot of polling, there's a lot of research that's done out there about public trust in science. There are all kinds of trust indices and trust barometers. You might know some coming out of the Wellcome Trust, the IMF, Pew Research, the Edelman Trust Barometer. There are many of them. And all of them were working hard, gauging trust in science, and they converge on a couple of shared points relevant to the US, but other countries as well. Public trust in science is lower now than it was pre-pandemic. Another shared finding is that trust and distrust in science are politically polarized. We see more trust in science among the progressive left, more distrust in science among the conservative right. And it's not just trust in science. It seems like we've got across the board lower trust, lower trust in influential business sectors like media and big tech, lower trust in government, low trust in public health measures, and even lower trust in each other. And of course, everyone would like to know why. Why is there lower trust? And the most commonly given answer is misinformation. So the term, the disinformation order, that phrase was coined by a couple of political communications researchers, Lance Bennett and Stephen Livingston, in the paper that you see on your screen here. And they coined this, they used this term to describe the breakdown of multiple knowledge, information, and communication systems. And what they see it as, they think that all these breakdowns total a new social and political order that they called the disinformation order. I'm just going to quote from their 2018 paper. Many democratic nations are experiencing increased levels of false information circulating through social media and political websites that mimic journalism formats. In many cases, this disinformation is associated with efforts of movements and parties on the radical right to mobilize supporters against center parties and their mainstream press that carries their messages. So in this account of the disinformation order and others that are similar to it, we get an account of disinformation that it behaves parasitically. Disinformation grafts onto otherwise healthy information ecosystems and affects whatever it touches. And the results, of course, are disastrous. Quoting again from these authors, declining citizen confidence in institutions undermines the credibility of official information in the news, opens publics to alternative information sources. Those sources undermine institutional legitimacy and destabilize center parties, governments, elections, and information in the news. So you might have not heard the name disinformation order before, but you've probably heard similar phrasings. You've heard of post-truth, you've heard of post-fact, and they're all pointing to a similar phenomena, a corrupted information ecosystem where truth and lies have been turned upside down, where what used to stabilize the truth, mainly the legacy media, is no longer trusted, and there's sort of chaos because of that. These narratives often will usually point to 2016 as a pivotal year for misinformation as a whole. And that, of course, is because Trump happened that year, Trump's election, and Brexit. So those, of course, are significant geopolitical changes with lots of implications for information and misinformation out there. But there were other things that happened that year. One notable change in 2016 was a flood of funding dollars being poured into what was then a much smaller research area called misinformation studies. And since 2016, there's been enormous outputs in this area of research, and of course, more research dollars have followed. The field of misinformation studies has grown so quickly that it was described by a critic in 2022, just 6 years later, as being too big to fail. And I'm telling you this because I want to suggest that this urgency, this urgent narrative of disinformation chaos was already in place at the start of COVID. And because of that, it is unsurprising that when we encountered public resistance to science and public health measures during COVID, it just couldn't be interpreted any other way. It was unlikely to be interpreted as anything but a misinformation problem. What I'm trying to say is that the explanatory structure was so firmly in place that anything we saw was going to be interpreted as misinformation, as a misinformation problem. And that is exactly what we saw during the months and years of the COVID pandemic. It was a problem of misinformation. It was a pandemic of misinformation. That idea really colored a lot of the discourse on public controversy over public health efforts during the pandemic. It was very common to hear refrains from public-facing science communicators like Neil deGrasse Tyson saying things like misconceptions about science fuel pandemic debates and controversies. And that's a little bit tame. Most of the statements being made were that misinformation was the cause of public unrest and public harm during COVID. Misinformation even, I think, peaked in terms of relevance a little later in 2023 when misinformation was cited as the leading cause of death in the US. Of course, you're wondering who said it and why. And that statement came from the head of the FDA, Robert Califf, the FDA commissioner, and he was speaking to a finding that had come out in April 2023 that US citizens' life expectancy is now lower compared to citizens of other high-income countries. Asked why that was, he said misinformation. And that's kind of an amazing statement, right? More than occupational hazards, more than environmental hazards, more than social determinants of health and disease, misinformation was number one. And he made this statement on Texas Public Radio, and I'm going to read a quote from that interview, my transcription, but I think I got it right. In the good old days, when I was a practicing cardiologist, for the most part, people developed products, they got through the FDA, the label determined what was talked about, the internet didn't exist, you advertised them at medical meetings and in journals. Now everyone's included because everyone is connected to the internet. We can put out a statement about what we've determined based on the highest level of evidence. Within 10 minutes, someone who's thought 10 minutes about it can reach 1 billion people, and there's nothing that restricts them from telling things that are not true. So this is there's other features here that are common to this description of the disinformation order that I'm trying to get at, this misinformation moment. It is this insistence that this is a relatively new phenomena, that things used to be different. There was a time when facts mattered, and this was a time, good old days, as Califf calls it, when government institutions were trusted, when legacy media shaped a healthy information ecosystem, and experts were recognized for their expertise. So with that history in place, and with the sense of what's been lost, trust in institutions, the media, experts, the desired future then is to restore the primacy of science, truth, and facts. And these goals are captured in the myth-busting approach to science communications. Okay, so now we can talk about science communications. That was the narrative that justifies something like myth-busting as a way to communicate to the public. Okay, so this confidence in the misinformation narrative and its corrective, which is something akin to fact-checking, was evident in public health outreach during COVID. Communications, I'd say most of the communications utilized a myth-busting frame, which I'm going to describe, and then I'm going to link it to the misinformation narrative that I have just described, and I will soon criticize. So on your screen here, you see an infographic that came out from the CDC regarding COVID-19 vaccination. I called it a myth busting or myth versus fact. It's called the myth fact message framework in advertising and marketing research. Myth busting is kind of the is sometimes the term that's used for it just because of that. Maybe you remember that show on Discovery Channel called Mythbusters I was on for many years. So that's where the term came from. And you see myth versus fact right at the top of that infographic. And you see this tidy separation, scientific facts and non-scientific fiction, that's the red column, and that can be rumors, conspiracies, myths, anything like that. And these infographics were everywhere. I'd be surprised if you never saw something like that. Of course, the agenda here is to target misinformation in the red column, correct it with scientific facts in the green, and we sometimes call that debunking. So you bust the myths or you debunk the misinformation. And myth busting has been a growth area of public science communications during COVID. And I'll just give you a little bit of an illustration of that. Here are just 4 of hundreds, maybe thousands of accounts that I found on Twitter during those long COVID years. And you can see these accounts have names like Virology Mythbusters, COVID-19 Mythbusters, COVID Fact Check UK, COVID-19 Vaccine Fact Check India. Here is WHO website. Their advice for the publics: use this myth fact framework. You see Mythbusters right here, and you can get all kinds of myth busting information. So you start with the lie and you give them the truth. That's the Mythbusters, and that's how they communicated all kinds of health advice to the public. This is from the Johns Hopkins Medical School website. They did a myth versus fact series featuring faculty experts addressing the myths with the facts. There were many of these myth versus facts articles published during COVID, and they all looked somewhat similar. It started with myth in dark or font, followed by the fact, and usually some kind of debunking of the myth. I'm going to read you the tiny print. I know you can't see it. Just to give you a feel for it, it says, myth, the COVID-19 vaccine can affect women's fertility. Fact, the COVID-19 vaccine will not affect fertility. The truth is that COVID-19 vaccine encourages the body to create copies of the spike protein found on the coronavirus surface. This teaches the body's immune system to fight the virus that has the specific spike protein in it. And then it goes on to debunk the myth by explaining some confusion that arose on social media, misidentifying the spike protein in the coronavirus to be the same one as another spike protein that is involved with the growth and the attachment of the placenta during pregnancy. So with my little smattering of examples, I hope to make some general characteristics of this myth versus fact framework. So this form of science communications targets propositional claims. It grabs the fake the fake propositions and tries to replace it with some kind of truth. There are numerous dichotomies that are invoked here, not just the myth versus fact columns that you see here, but you've got, of course, facts versus falsehoods, but also a neat division between experts and public, and also the scientific sphere versus the public or political sphere. The popularity of the myth-fact frame also deserves some comment. Myth busting was so popular during the COVID period, and still, that you could find many templates, easy to use templates that you could fill in by yourself and make your own myth busting infographic. Now, as for why this practice was so popular, probably the best reason is that this approach seems to make sense. We know people go online looking for health information. They will likely encounter misinformation. So why not just get in there and get the right information put out in front of them? That seems to make sense. Another is that it is easy to do. It is something that you don't need a big PR budget for. You just need a little bit of time and a social media account. It seemed that a lot of well-intended people who were frustrated about, let's say, lockdown periods during COVID wanted to get online, help people, and share their information. There's also familiarity to this approach because it was used prior to COVID to address other types of vaccine hesitancy. I'll tell you, it never worked very well, but at least people saw it and said, yes, I've seen that before. So familiarity is there. Another big boon for this myth message frame is it seems to be bolstered by a lot of cognitive and behavioral psychology research into misinformation, especially research into belief acquisition and information processing. So this area of research, psychology of misinformation, does experimental interventions to see if they can minimize the uptake and impact of misinformation on people's beliefs, participants' beliefs and actions. And researchers have come up with a number of strategies that they think can be used in the public sphere, not tested yet. Things like debunking, that's a reactive intervention. What you do, someone comes across false information, you debunk the myth, you expose the lie, and they've also come up with preemptive interventions, kind of tell people what to expect from the lie, and then they'll know it when they see it. So we call it pre-bunking and even inoculation against misinformation. Okay, that's a cute term, but that's what they use. Now, popularity aside, there are actual significant problems with the myth-busting frame. First are the outcomes from that psychology of misinformation research that I just mentioned. The findings are really not impressive. At best, the studies seem to find short-lived attitudinal shifts. So they'll ask a person, what do you think about fertility and COVID vaccines, for example? That's their prior beliefs. They'll do an intervention and then ask them again, do you think COVID vaccines cause infertility? And they might find this short-lived change where people become less committed to their prior belief that COVID causes infertility. But this does not last very long. It is also that whatever attitudinal shifts that we do find, it doesn't seem to translate in behavioral changes. The behavioral change is measured by its sort of proxy, like your intention to vaccinate, and that doesn't seem to change, even when you're a little more informed about COVID vaccines. It might even make it worse. There is at least discussion about whether it creates a backfire effect, as in it makes people more insistent on vaccines being dangerous. So the backfire effect is when providing corrective information makes the receiver of the information dig in their heels and make them more committed to the view that COVID vaccines are dangerous. And why is this? Researchers hypothesize that it's probably motivated reasoning that kicks in once your prior belief that why you shouldn't vaccinate is shaken. Epistemic agents seem to move the goalpost and find other reasons not to vaccinate. I put a question mark beside it because I do want to clarify that the backfire effect as a phenomena is contested. Misinformation studies' biggest supporters say that this backfire effect has not been replicated in any studies. Well, of course, others insist that it has. But still, what we do have here are very meager outcomes in this area of research, at least the possibility of the backfire effect, and it does not seem to slow down this area of study. it doesn't stop researchers from trying and insisting that the next one is going to work. Second problem with the myth fact message frame, this second strike, it comes from science communication studies. The problem is that the underlying assumptions and values of myth busting are at odds with pretty much all of science communications research into public uptake of science. So there is a clear disconnect between the research and the practice in science communications, and I think that deserves comment. So there has been more than 30 years of science communications research disavowing the knowledge deficit model of science communications. So what is that? That is the idea that the reason the public resists science is due to some kind of knowledge gap. The public has some kind of deficit. The goal of science communications then is to fill that gap with the requisite knowledge. And the further assumption is that once that knowledge gap is filled, the public will be more likely to make decisions that are in line with the scientific consensus on any given topic. And where did I get that number? More than 30 years. This is the flagship journal for public science communications. It's called Public Understanding of Science. The first issue came out in 1992. I went back and looked at the first issue, and you will find journal articles saying, from that 1992 issue, saying we need to stop with the knowledge deficit model already. We need to find something better for public science communications. I'll say before I say anything about those models, I would like to say something about how the knowledge deficit and the model of public science communications fit together. So this image on your screen here is a visual representation of the deficit model. It is also called the public education model, but I think deficit is more common, and it is characterized by unidirectional discourse. The scientists have all the answers, the experts know what it is that we need to know. The knowledge is produced here, and it is imparted to publics who are clearly in need of information because they have this knowledge gap. And you can see, I think, this distinction, the differentiation between the experts and the non-experts is reproduced here in these columns found in the myth versus fact. Reproduced visually, but also conceptually. The knowledge, the expert knowledge is here, public understanding it, and knowledge is here. Only one of them is worth knowing and worth taking seriously. The other one really needs to be changed. Okay, so what's been proposed instead? So this I think in some ways encapsulates the 30 years of public science communications. You see the deficit model on top. Below are two models. One is called the public debate model, and one is the co-production of knowledge model, and they are trying to move away from that one-way discourse where the experts know everything and the publics know nothing. And you see, at least you're starting to see a little bit of feedback from the publics in this model, and a little more, in fact, something more like collaboration between science and the publics in this co-production model. I'll say a little bit more about that. This is, of course, alternatives to the public education model. I wanted to zoom in just so you could see it better. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you see it is clearly presented as an alternative, a correction to the public education or deficit model, and they are proposing a very different relationship between science and the public. These types of models are called public engagement models because we actually talk with the public and hear what they have to say. That's different. And what it starts with is this bidirectional discourse between experts and the publics. And once that knowledge becomes bidirectional, the relationship between scientific experts and the public necessarily change. These alternative models move away from that dichotomy of the all-knowing expert and the uninformed publics. Science is also knocked down a few notches from the view that science is somehow all-encompassing and fully explanatory. Like, it's the science that will tell us what to do. Public knowledge, sometimes called lay knowledge or even lay expertise in the sociology literature, literature is elevated. It is actually recognized as valuable and informative to science policy and policy-driven science. Not to say that the publics are equivalent to scientific experts, but they have something valuable to contribute to this discussion. Understanding of complex phenomena is no longer exclusively expert-driven. Instead, engaging with the public is epistemically fruitful. So the kinds of science communication activities that suit this model are not going to be infographics. Instead, it's going to be more two-way. Things like public deliberation models that are used for science policy issues. You've maybe heard the term mini publics or citizen juries, where you gather people together and talk about new technologies or about science policy. Any sort of deliberative democracy exercise in the realm of as a form of science communications is kind of what you're looking for here. Another thing that's different about these alternative models is that they question whether it is the job of science communicators to make the public dutifully accept what the scientists tell them. Most of the researchers in this field think that public science communications should involve engaging with imperfect science in the real world and calling it that. Don't teach the mythology of all-knowing or truth-seeking science, and instead be honest about science's messiness, be critical of scientific elites when that is warranted, and of course struggle to democratize science. Okay, so now I want to come back to cultural narratives. So far, I've introduced to you a narrative, the narrative of the disinformation order. Myth-busting is then presented as the communications practice that best solves the problem that misinformation that the misinformation narrative identifies. And that narrative and an alternative narrative that I'm about to present are all responses to the pressing question, why do people resist science? And that, of course, is a well-traversed area of scholarship. You find lots of work on it in STS, in communications, psychology, neuroscience, and a fair bit now in philosophy of science as well. Misinformation, I've already mentioned, is the most popular answer, but I think there are better ones. So I dove into this question myself, specifically when I was working on vaccine hesitancy. And of course, the dominant answer to that question, why do people vaccinate about vaccines, was scientific illiteracy, the public scientific illiteracy. That was some years ago. We've shifted the language to misinformation now, but we are talking about the same knowledge deficit there. The problem is with the publics. The publics don't understand, and of course, if they understood, things would be different. So it didn't, I just said it didn't take me very long to reject that explanation. And I think to get a more thorough answer to the question, you need a better understanding of the cultural meanings and significance that are tied to health technologies like vaccines. So I'm going to draw from some of my own work here to make this point. So vaccines should be understood, at least in part, by their outsized symbolism. They elicit feelings of hope and scientific marvel, but they also generate feelings of fear and resistance. Vaccines invite an ethos of community and solidarity, as well as concerns about political repression and medical tyranny. So this is all to say that these little technologies, these vaccines, are sufficiently infused with meaning that hesitancy about vaccines cannot and should not be reduced to a single cause explanation, something like misinformation. It's just more complicated than that. And I even took a shot at answering, what it's all about here. I'm quoting from myself here. I wrote, vaccine debates are about much more than vaccines. Instead capturing a cluster of temporally, geographically, and historically specific concerns. In liberal democratic societies, those concerns include how technology shapes our lives, who decides and regulates technological intrusions on our lives, knowledge and power, science for the people or science for corporate interests, government overreach, individual liberty, globalization, multiculturalism, pluralism, community cohesion, health disparities, income inequality, and many other issues. And I could have elaborated on those issues. So if this quote is right, then it shouldn't be surprising that the myth-fact framework doesn't really work, because that frame silences all of these considerations, preferring instead a singular attribution to misinformation as the problem and facts as the solution. So I'd like to say some critical things about misinformation studies. There are criticisms of this area of research already in circulation. I'm going to share some of the criticisms that have come out, and then I'm going to add a new one. So first is, I already mentioned how misinformation studies really grew quickly, lots of interest, lots of funding, and it's been criticized for that very fast pace and furious funding. It seems to have shaped a haphazard discourse. Among the things that you see are an overuse of very unthoughtful jargon, things like post-truth, post-fact society, truth decay, information warfare. There's a lot of them. Now, these terms do some things well. They are good at impressing the urgency of the misinformation problem, and hence the need for more funding, but they also taint the discourse. They seep into every element of the ensuing discussion. How we tell the story of online disinformation informs the arguments, it frames the research, and of course, it shapes the responses. So I'm going to focus, just to illustrate this, I'm going to focus on my least favorite trope, which is post-truth. And the very term post-truth, it suggests that there was a past where truth reigned. The data to support this idea that we live in uniquely misinformed times is really quite sketchy. It's nothing new to have well-funded campaigns of disinformation. We used to call that propaganda. And just to complicate things, they sometimes came from democratic government leadership, rather than fringe groups or foreign interference. They were also supported by the legacy media, for example, during war times. Now, as for the legacy media's role in stabilizing truth, once again, the historical record doesn't concur. You only need to look to mass communication studies to see very routine challenges of problematic narratives advanced by the media conglomerates. Just to give an example, the American broadsheets and broadcast networks, the legacy press, American legacy press, have long been criticized for enabling white supremacy in the country by misconstruing the prevalence of Black violence and crime compared to white violence and crime, and for constructing the trope of the welfare queen. The Black press, of course, presents alternative perspectives to white dominant media. They cover stories that are ignored by the white dominant press, and they counter racist depictions. So if anything, I'd like us to pause and not wax nostalgic for the pre-social media informational ecosystem, the good old days, as the head of the FDA called them. Now, some of these critics of misinformation studies make this demand. They demand that any study of mis and disinformation needs to put considerations of power to the forefront. They say this is a politics of knowledge. So whose interests do misinformation and its corrective, which is fact-checking, serve? Who gets the epistemic privilege of knowing the truth? And I can endorse that corrective. So I agree with all these criticisms. I won't add any more to those, but what I will do is add one more criticism. I've come to think of misinformation studies as a hammer that treats everything as a nail. So you've heard that old adage, all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Well, I think everything looks like a nail right now. Taking us back to COVID, accepting intrusive public health policies, no matter how essential, depends on trust. Trust in the facts, but also trust in the institutions that produce and evaluate the evidence and weigh the trade-offs. The contentious policies during COVID were those ones that impacted freedom of movement. So vaccinations or masks as entry requirements, school closures, business closures. And of course, these policies were justified by a set of priorities. They served to restrict disease transmission and thereby avoid illness and death, or at least keep healthcare facilities functional. And arguments against these policies were often flagged by social media algorithms as misinformation. So a question, was it misinformation that prompted this kind of resistance? I think we can accept, sure, misinformation proliferated, no question there. We can also accept that resistors often repeated those false claims, but those propositional claims, those false claims, were arguably proxies for the values that were at stake, for what really mattered to those dissenting voices. So I think it's the framing of the COVID problem and the policy solutions to it that were contested, and then it got all mixed up with claims, with misinformation. So who gets to define the problem and thereby who gets to direct the solution is important here. The STS scholars Phil Gardner and colleagues had this comment. They were speaking to what I think is the dominant value that was prioritized for these kind of lockdown measures, epidemiological measures of deaths averted. Of course, they wrote epidemiological measures of death averted don't capture other essential dimensions of life: economic, social, political, and even spiritual. Policies aimed primarily at reducing health risks are suspect to those who see other critical needs as being unjustifiably neglected. So this is all to say that there are different sets of priorities, different concerns that could define the COVID problem very differently, but certain priorities were privileged, and maybe they were the right ones. Those values, where we get into trouble is that those values that were prioritized were called scientific, were said to be grounded in science, while alternative voices were called unscientific. So as I see it, that misinformation hammer seemed to beat down alternative framings and priorities that did not come from the highest levels of government and scientific advisory boards. The alternative voices were cast as misinformed. I'll add that this confident insistence on what are the facts and what are the myths, which of course you have to be confident about when you're doing myth versus fact framing, that rarely matched the science. The science was emerging, it was uncertain given the novelty of everything. Because of that, we know that there was at least some scientific suppression of discordant views, of vaccine injuries, of the origins of the virus, and that the presence of that phenomena further troubles the epistemic weight that is given to the facts. So this overstated stability of the facts seems to silence the public. And that expert versus public dichotomy is mirrored in the fact-myths discourse. And that should give us pause. I think separating fact from fiction seems reasonable and even necessary, but that corollary of only the political and scientific elites being recognized as sources of reliable information does not sit as comfortably. It also doesn't make for good communications if you don't know who your audience is. When people seek health information online or elsewhere, they come to the task with prior knowledge and experiences and concerns about their health. And this myth versus fact and didactic model of teacher imparting knowledge on a slack-jaw pupil, which we see in the deficit model, we see that in myth-busting communications. It doesn't capture the public's, their experiences. It doesn't capture who you are talking to. So I've made these claims just to conclude that the disinformation order does not explain public resistance to science, and I think it should be rejected as the cultural narrative to explain the problem and then justify the communications solution. So what I've been doing is advancing a new narrative When I ask who frames the problem, I'm giving an alternative narrative to the disinformation order. And my focus has been on what I understand to be the public's insistent demand for participation in meaning making. And me saying this is not meant to be an apology for the violence, any irrational claims, the presence of persuasive disinformants, the chaos that many of us experience because of this push. It is, however, a shift of attention, calling attention to this demand for public participation. And if you think that public demand for participation hasn't gone well, then a good communication strategy might be needed to work that out. Okay, and I'm now going to present the alternative communications model, which is communications as meaning making. It is an approach to science communications that I think fits better with the more complicated narrative of public resistance to science that I have introduced. So as a research area, this area of communications investigates the various meanings that diverse stakeholders bring to any issue. And as a practice aimed at the public, it seeks to collectively invoke new shared meanings. And I was going to have to talk about John Dewey eventually, so here I am talking about John Dewey. John Dewey's work has been, later work, has been characterized by James Carey, who is a communications researcher. He says, Dewey captured communications to fall into two types. One is a transmission view, which focuses on knowledge, dissemination, and persuasion. And the other is a ritual view, which is a negotiation of shared beliefs and meanings. And as far as I can tell, I think the transmission view is what prevails in the myth versus fact communications strategies, while something more like the ritual view is what we find in this communications as meaning making that I'm hoping to present to you. And I'll do that right now. So sticking with Dewey, like others in the pragmatist tradition, committed to an ontology where understanding the world is not unearthing its fundamental truths, but it's more about experiencing events and interpreting events. Communications therefore become central because communications are the access point to understanding. Understanding is negotiated collaboratively by actors or stakeholders in a culture or in a society. Of course, there's a pragmatist account of truth working its way in here. Truth is constituted by the problems we are trying to solve, and of course, it is co-constituted by the problem solvers. And because of that, communications are not one-way transactions. They are instead a process that forms our experiences of and relationships with each other and the material world in which we live. Okay, so I made this. I just want to make a little bit of distinctions between myth busting and meaning making. Get a sense of meaning making by differentiating it from myth busting. So what are we doing here as a communications theory? It is something more akin to the ritual view. Meaning making is working to create shared understanding, to create a world that we can live within, rather than focusing on knowledge dissemination. The publics are differently characterized. They can be diverse, first of all, and they come in with relevant experiences and expertise. The publics are said to possess relevant knowledge and values. Not scientific expertise, but relevant knowledge to the problems that we are trying to solve. Understanding is not uniquely expert-driven, but co-constituted by all the stakeholders. And science, of course, is a little bit different. It is messy, it is fallible, it is contested, it is value-laden. Okay, now I need to bring in a little bit of framing theory, because I keep talking about frames. I asked who gets to frame COVID and tie that into to meaning making. So I have characterized vaccines as artifacts. That is, those are objects with symbolic value. Dewey characterizes science communications and meaning making as a ritual view. And both of those points point to framing theory in mass communications studies. I'm not going to go into mass communication studies and framing theory because there's too much. I know that it's a concept that's done well. Most people, if you say what is a communications frame, they'll say something like this. You know, how you frame the issue affects how people respond to it. So just some definitions. Frames are interpretive stories that communicate what is at stake in a societal debate and why things matter. Frames create meanings by directing our attention in some ways and away from others, thereby creating meaning. They direct and constrain possible understandings of things and responses to the message. Frames are also an unavoidable part of science communications. And I'll give some examples of the unavoidability of framing in science communication. It's unavoidable in any form of communication, but we're focused on science communications here. So this is an example, a couple of examples just from some of the literature. When you write a grant proposal, when you write a journal article, if a scientist provides expert testimony, they are emphasizing certain technical details over others because their goal is to maximize persuasion and to maximize understanding across contexts. Okay, so they pick the goal and they frame their discourse in such a way. Similarly, science journalists and press officers negotiate certain story angles when they are talking about scientific studies. They'll favor particular themes and narratives over others. Now, I've been reading on science communications, the science communications literature on meaning making. I thought that I would find an easy tie between the two, but meaning making is an ambiguous enough phrase that it's used in a lot of ways. So there is discussion about meaning making in the SciComm's literature, but they used it slightly differently from what I was looking for. What I did find was a body of literature that talks about science communications as culture. And I think that was sort of capturing what I was trying to do here, what I was looking for, this idea that we are finding ways to understand things together. So what is culture? When people talk about what is culture, the science communicators usually focus on the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who has the very famous book, The Interpretation of Culture, came out in 1973, and he said this, between believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. So culture, as it is used in the science communications literature that I want to talk about, is this webs of significance, much like how a frame will focus your attention in one direction and not in others. And of course, it is something in search of meaning. You can see where meaning making starts to come in. So it is the webs of significance ascribed to events after we reflect and interpret our primary experiences. This good work on science communications as culture is mainly coming out of work in Denmark by the communications researchers Sarah Davies, this is Sarah Davies here, and Maya Horst. And the type of questions that are made, so first of all, sorry, I missed this, investigates science communications as culture or meaning making, investigates the meanings that are made, they are negotiated and reinforced through science communications, recognizing that the purpose of science communications, like what the author intended, is not necessarily how it's going to be received. In fact, these researchers describe a repurposing and repackaging of science communications. When you talk to me, you have a purpose. I might interpret it to mean different things and to serve different purposes, and I throw it back out there. So there's much more engagement and negotiation of meaning. So the type of research questions that these communications theorists ask are, what does this instance of communication mean to different actors involved in it? What wider societal norms and values does it refer to or reinforce? What broader systems of meaning making is it part of? And I think these are great questions. These are the same questions now. And they can be applied to all forms of science communications. They can be applied to science fiction books, to myth versus fact infographics, to public deliberations on science policy, science cafes. And to investigate these questions is to recognize the broader context in which science communications are received and challenged, and as I mentioned, repackaged to suit other interests than what the producer intended. So I've already mentioned the work of Sarah Davies. This paper that you see imaged here, Sarah Davies and colleagues, is called Science Stories as Culture. And in this article, the researchers examined all kinds of science stories, so all types of science fiction, as cultural artifacts. They explained that fictional narratives can communicate all the significant elements in science, including not just the factual stuff, but also the political, economic, and social uses of science. And that's important because there has been research showing that these cultural meanings of science, by which I mean the political, the economic, the social, and not the scientific knowledge itself, is probably the most significant contributor to public attitudes towards science. It's what the publics actually care about when they get concerned about science. So the authors explain that fictional stories can significantly influence public attitudes towards science by cultivating or reinforcing certain cultural meanings of science. And because of that, the use of fiction for science communication is valuable because it contextualizes science's implications for society. Things like its value as a human activity, the consequences of its use or misuse, and its ideological status. And that's what people want to know. The meaning making arises largely because artifacts are not studied in isolation, because all the experiences of stakeholders are considered. And when you look at scientific artifacts that way, you begin to see the cultural matrix in which science necessarily functions. And you also don't miss other elements of culture that are equally part of that matrix. So it goes broad. Okay, so meaning making, the hope is that we can create shared understanding. It's not agreement, but shared understanding. If it's done well, if we can create shared understanding, the hope is that we would see less polarized public responses to science policy than we see right now. This is, as you can see, this is taken from a climate change policy. We love science on one side. This is COVID on the other side. But what you see, the distinction here is science yes and science no. And neither of those are very helpful ways to think about how science operates in our society. In this context, thinking about science as meaning making would allow for science to be properly studied, conducted, and contested regarding policy rather than serving as a proxy for a set of political commitments, which I think is what we're seeing now. Of course, science denial points to a set of political commitments that you might find objectionable, but We Heart Science points to a different set of political commitments that not everyone agrees with. We Love Science doesn't capture what we actually need to do for effective climate response. I don't think it's much more helpful than science denial. Instead, we need some new language and we need new ideas to elicit new meanings and shared understandings. So prioritizing public engagement of this sort, attending to alternative frames and meanings shaping science communications and its uptake by diverse publics invites different purposes for science communications and new measures for success. I think we'd have much less of the before and after surveys asking you, okay, how strongly do you believe that anthropogenic climate change is real before the intervention, and how much do you believe it after it? And instead, we're looking for something more long-term in terms of the meanings people ascribe to science, the understanding of how it shapes our lives and our well-being. It's more about public science, enculturation, and of course, trust. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up, just make a few summary comments. I started with the infodemic. I was calling attention to the informational problems in our decision-making context. I didn't question that that we have a misinformation problem. However, I didn't think that that captured the entirety of the problem. Instead, the decisions that we are having trouble making exceeds what science can provide for us here. The disinformation order does not capture public resistance to science either. And because of that, I don't think myth busting will ever be an effective communications strategy. Instead, a meaning-making approach attends to cultural narratives and the significance that we place upon scientific artifacts. And although there's no straight line to how we do this, the hope is that we can undermine the polarized discourse of misinformation and its ties to power and put science on some sort of better setting to actually help us with the problems we need to solve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. That was really interesting.
Thanks so much.
I, of course, have a million questions, but I'm going to put myself as the third questioner.
Okay.
I have to do this, otherwise I'd be right up there. So,
Thank you. So it's clear that the goal of this meeting making is the shared understanding between science and the public, but I was really curious about the role of policymakers here. Like, what role do they have in meeting making between science and the public?
Policymakers, it kind of depends where policies come in. I've seen different models where policymakers come in after there's some kind of set of agreement. An agreement can be different things. It can be the scientists suggest this, and we think the public would if not agree to it, or at least be okay with it. Other times, policymakers are part of the shaping of that narrative. I think there is a place for science policy makers, probably in the framing of the issue and the working through of potential solutions. If anything, because scientists can tell us what the science says about this or that, but they usually can't tell us what we should do about it. So I see room for policymakers to actually do things like lay out options. Of course, those options are not just, they're not just being honest brokers here. They're giving sort of normative accounts of what they think ought to be done, but we can at least be transparent about what our options are and why one might be preferable over another. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I have two kind of questions. I think they're pretty intertwined.
Okay.
It's about kind of the context of where this meaning-making science communication strategy would work in practice. The first one was about the context of the COVID-19 pandemic as a whole. At least in my experience and the experience of a lot of people, was that it was kind of characterized by chaos and the sense of urgency. And so my sort of reflex kind of justification for using some kind of myth busting strategy is that, well, it's just like you can just put it out there. You don't have to have some kind of consultation back and forth.
Right.
And so I was wondering what the sort of context of like urgency of the pandemic has to do with the meaning-making communication strategy. And the other one was about the role of ingrained social injustices in the healthcare system. Like a lot of the discourse about vaccine hesitancy in Australia and New Zealand is about Indigenous hesitancy and sort of the role of like historic injustices in the healthcare system. And so I guess that part is just inviting me to talk a little bit about how the meaning-making science communication strategy can kind of help alleviate rather than entrench those kinds of injustices.
Sure, those are great questions. So the time frame is always going to be a problem, especially that these kind of communication, these kind of consultations are usually not binding. We're not talking about doing a public referendum on public health measures. That's probably not a good idea. But what we are doing is opening room for discussion and debate. There is at least some evidence to show that people want to be heard, even if they don't get what they want. There's something to having a good process and procedures for it. And there were at least small examples of that happening during COVID, actually around addressing vaccine hesitancy to racialized groups. There were many, I'm aware of them in Canada. I know some of them in the US as well. Usually town hall meetings done online. So we have the technology for it, where they would invite members of the community to learn and discuss, let's say, these new COVID vaccines. There was good practice done in terms of science communications, where they would often invite members of the community to lead the discussions. So things like, I remember I attended one, a virtual one for Black Canadians living in Toronto, and they had doctors and scientists who were members of that community. And what they could do was they were certainly not giving anything in terms of information, anything different from what we were receiving from Health Canada. These vaccines are good for these reasons, and here's why COVID is dangerous. But they could also, first of all, there is some research into, who the speaker is actually matters. If you see yourself in the speaker, you're more likely to trust them as a reliable source. And there were moments as I watched that panel where they could speak to their community. They could say things like, I know we are often mistreated in Canadian healthcare system. There's no question that we have grievances. And then they'd say, but this vaccine is what is going to keep us from dying at greater numbers than we are already. So they could speak to the specific issues, and they could speak, in relations of trust, of course, mediated through virtual communications that you don't get from some faceless scientist from the NIH or from Health Canada. So those are some examples of little ways that it could work, and it was done quite a bit. There was outreach in hospitals, speaking to vaccine hesitant healthcare workers. Like, it's usually done in sort of closed community groups, but it could even be done in very short time because we were dealing with this with the Zoom platforms and all kinds of virtual and sorry, back to the Canadian one, it actually helped. Like, there was we tracked it. There was tracking of it. Racialized communities in Canada had far lower intention to vaccinate even before the vaccines came out, and this kind of effort was done, and we saw an uptick. There was noticeable change except for a few groups that had, more convincing needed to be done. Convincing isn't the right word. More outreach had to be done. There was actually a change in attitudes.
I just skipped over Allison. Allison, you're on my list of, anyway. Rose, you were next after Allison.
I really appreciate this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I have a question or a comment, but it's something that I noticed and picked up, especially when you moved into the co-constitutive feature of meaning making, as perhaps like a response to, because you mentioned scientism, and then things came up with repression and tyranny, and you were talking about it not sitting well with scientific and political elites as the only sources of reliable information, right? And it's really the power dynamics between the myth busting and the meaning making laws that stand out to me, right? It's the unilateral versus the co-constitutive engagement that you described. And I think that's really important because, and I'm not sure if you share this sentiment with me or not, and maybe that's my question, is it seems like in philosophy generally, in philosophy of science, there's a sort of an assumption or a sense that scientism is no longer or never really was an issue, right? Or it's no longer an issue. And that just seems to me to be plainly false, especially when you consider super collective disciplines like STEM, right, and how they function in institutions, and become institutionalized. And of course, this is going to vary across the material context of different universities, but especially the way that it angles towards the local communities, it's just something that concerns me. And I think that's that's why I really love the Institute of Component, because, and especially when you just responded to Rose's comment, describing that town hall meeting where the discussion is led by community members who then direct the concerns so that their concerns can be directly responded to, because sometimes the messaging just completely misses the mark of what individuals are really care about. So I don't know, can you help me make sense of this?
I hope so. So yes, so you asked whether I think scientism is not seen as a big problem in philosophy. I guess I'd have to say it depends which angle you're looking at. Like I'd say philosophers who theorize from the margins are always worried about that, and the idea that science is either viewed as the voice of power or can become the voice of power.
Especially in social issues.
Especially on social issues. And that is probably my biggest concern about misinformation studies. I think it's a way to shut down debate. And I even say that with all the qualifications. Some debates are not worth having. I know that. But it became such a quick lever for shutting down dissent to a point that I think we should all be worried about that.
Okay,
Right?
so we have 5 more people on the list.
Okay.
I'm next though, because I told you in advance. Okay, so I had 2 questions, but I'll just ask one because I want to follow up and take it in a different direction.
Yeah.
And although I agree with you, and I'm generally, whenever I meet a dichotomy, I bring out the guns to blow it up, because I agree with you that dichotomizing things is always going to miss all of the interesting nuances of most social and scientific issues. But I wanted to challenge you a little bit about moving to a cultural account, and to a democratic kind of model of agreement making. And I'm wondering whether it may be that with respect to what is scientifically good for you, of course involves values about what you care about, but I'm wondering whether it invites a false equivalence here about it's not just we vote on whether or not the vaccine is good for us, right? So I'm just curious about when you start empowering other agents in the engagement and these kind of democratic engagements around practice and around science, how do you avoid the kind of false equivalence of empowering every voice is equal?
Right.
When science has a special role to play in these kinds of discourse.
Right. That's a good concern. I think it's a concern that consistently comes up on any discussion about sort of democratizing any kind of expert knowledge. So we can all point to all kinds of examples where the scientists should have listened to the people, and because they didn't, things went poorly. On the other hand, the people or the publics are not scientific experts, and that always needs to be recognized. So doing a vote on whether COVID vaccines are safe doesn't make sense at all. What it does make sense to do is to try to tease out what is the relevant concerns here, and importantly, disenfranchised groups especially are never asked, what are your concerns? And instead, any kind of resistance that they have will be misconstrued, will be called misinformation, will be characterized as somehow either ridiculous or impossible. I'd like to start with a more open position where we at least hear what people have to say. It doesn't mean that everyone gets what they want. We can't have everyone get what they want, but we can at least, create some kind of discussion context where you've had your say, and we try to operationalize what we can, but we also explain when we can't. Yeah. It's not easy, believe me. I don't think if I could come up with the infographic to do that, I would, but I don't think that's the kind of work. This is a more long-term goal.
Okay, Arnon, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed this, and I guess I basically buy the overall story. But I'm wondering about a particular element that you didn't sort of highlight this too much, but it's a question of like sort of whether science is value laden and the extent to which that is part of the story. I mean, you might have other reasons, independent reasons for thinking that, you know, a lot of the science, especially in these areas, is very, very value laden. But you could also, it seems to me, marry some of this story to a kind of modest, sort of non-value laden view of science, where you think like, look, science supplies you with certain pieces of information. Sometimes they're more, you know, there's more uncertainty, sometimes less. And that only gives you a very, very partial sort of element, or just one element in a much more sort of complicated sort of matrix of information and views and values that you need to come up with, you know, decisions about what to do. So is that kind of story, are you okay with it? Do you think like the reasons against it are independent of what you said today?
Usually when I think through whether the values matter for any scientific claims, the answer will usually be yes for me. But I recognize we are talking about scientific controversies here, and it could be that some of the values encouraging certain scientific findings over others are not central to the discussion. So things like, I think all health research is value laden if at minimum it is aimed at trying to improve health, right? And that's already a value. It's not a value that we can test very often. It might be how we do it that can test it. So the values there may not be very relevant to our discussion, but it doesn't make it value free. It just makes it a sort of a side issue. Now, around vaccines, there are many values that go in. It's much more than whether we promote health or not. There is some agreement on, you know, what would be an unacceptable outcome. Like when you listen to the discourse on vaccine hesitancy, there was actually agreement on what would be unacceptable. So things like serious adverse effects causing death, most people think is unacceptable. In fact, it can be low or at least close to zero. That's what most people want. Where we get into trouble is that there's disagreement about whether the scientists are being candid about whether we're actually measuring it properly and whether they're being candid about it. But the value agreement is actually there. But I still wouldn't call that value free. Just that's not the value that's in conflict. It's the operationalizing of it.
I mean, I have a question as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to ask a question about when it seems that, you know, there is a conflict between some specific, you know, cultural narratives, and then people want to use science specifically to just bust those cultural narratives. It kind of reminded me, you know, of Bacon's promise by Janet Brown, that, you know, science is supposed to bring a lot of, you know, was supposed to deliver a lot of promises, and it couldn't. And one reason that, you know, Karani says like feminist philosophers of science are a little bit mad at science is just because they thought that science is going to be an ally, that, you know, it's going to miss some of this, you know, narratives, cultural narratives that societies have about like gender, the capabilities of different, or dimorphism now probably. How can the meaning making approach actually be utilized when at least some group of people are really thinking of science in terms of just busting those narratives that are supposed to be at the table?
I think the meaning making might be necessary around sort of what we expect science to be able to do in terms of solving social problems. There seems to be a desire to get past political disagreements and moral disputes and make everything evidence-based, and that has never worked. It'll resolve some issues, but chances are it'll even introduce new ones. The science is not going to solve those kind of questions. It is informative to certain positions, but those positions need to be elaborated on, including the values that that come in with those alternative positions. So if feminist scientists are disappointed in science, it's because they weren't realistic about what science could do.
Thanks. I really enjoyed that. You guys, I kind of just had like, I guess, we're talking about just like how the stuff you're saying, like framing and sort of law meaning making. So like the meaning making approach seemed very like, it seemed like you're very like democratic, collaborative processing of information, sharing, cultivating. But then, I mean, I guess it was worried with the framing effect stuff that what you're talking about is like hijacking people's attentional limitations to sort of manipulate them into choosing the way you want. And I mean, maybe that's not the right way to think about it, but that seems at odds with the.
You make a good point, and I would, I'd be willing to go look at it again. I kind of suggested it that I thought there'd be a clear science communications as meaning making literature to draw from, and instead it did it sort of around the way they talked about culture, which there's a whole communications as culture literature, and it seems like framing effect comes in there, but not directly. So I've been struggling with this this presentation for like 2 weeks because I couldn't kind of make the line that I was trying to make, and I am willing to reconsider if framing effect is actually, I get it. You're concerned about that sort of nefarious version where I direct my attention here so I don't see that. And that you're right, that that's not what I'm suggesting. So maybe I need to rethink that. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. So I was just, this is not, it's kind of a question about something that I think, I'm sure you probably thought about, so I'm sure it's not just missing from the whole picture, but it is in the presentation. And I think it's a very big cliche. So when you were talking about the good old days quote, and how clearly sort of the reception that, especially how back in the day it was better, people like the newspapers were telling the truth and we had a reliable source of knowledge. That difference isn't really there. But what I took from the quote, and I agree with you that surely that isn't there, and surely there's never been like a lot of that in the past. But the difference I think that the quote is specifically pointing towards was the difference in sort of, you mentioned chaos stuff, and I think the chaos created nowadays is created in like the new media as well. And it's like, even if there was propaganda, the ease and quickness of communication among people around the world, and when people that doesn't have to go through any kind of institution, that can just be direct. That's it. And I think it is like it's a big in everything. So wondering how that's.
Some of the literature suggests that it's not a new thing. It's just, of course, everything is amplified to proportions that we've never seen before. There's so much easy access to information and misinformation. So, I'm trying to think through questions like, why do people even believe things on the internet? We kind of know better. So why is it that people seek information? Apparently at the start of COVID, there was a very good health information seeking behavior. People were visiting official websites much more than the questionable ones. And that lasted for a while. So, the CDC, the NIH, that kind of thing. And then it started to diverge. So it gave us, it at least suggested that a good chunk of the publics know better than to believe everything someone sends them on WhatsApp. But the fact that they don't do it tells me that they're not satisfied with the official accounts. So that gets into trust issues, which with official sources of information. And then we're in trouble. Is that promoted by misinformation? Maybe a little bit, but it also demands a little bit of a reflection on what our scientific institutions are doing to maintain the trust of the public. And there's a lot of suggestion that they could be doing better. You know, things like more arm's length from industry interests, more consultation with the public, things like that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, yeah, I mean, that was, and I can imagine that there is literature suggesting that it's a difference in scale and not in sort of essence. And so I also wasn't really suggesting that the issue here is like, oh, people read everything that they read online. I think it's more this, that I think a big part is, I mean, this is just my hunch on sort of what you said, isn't like, oh, you know, we have to get this website from the government, and now it's like people are seeking unity, right? And I think the big difference is even if you didn't believe what was being told, you know, in the past communities were just normalized, right? And now you can have a community of people that you've never met before, but full of a lot of the, you know, the bubbles of people believing things outside of who are based on community building, people, you know, finding that sort of community that they kind of like finding in their proximity. And I guess what I was trying to say is, I think to me it sounds like that's actually something that now might be a problem, but could actually just be part of the solution, because your framework is a framework of you know, debate and communication. And you know, I mean, you know, there's a field of new media studies that study exactly how like communication around the world has been transformed in a different way than we used to have like newspapers and stuff. And so I'm sure there's branch of that literature that focuses on science as well.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you for those thoughts. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
But is there anybody who would like to ask in the back?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. In defense of myth making, myth busting, right? Defense of myth busting, a rather interesting, very specific case in a general field might have some applicability. But within a community of like-minded people, and scientists or something like that, a rather interesting case of myth busting like your talk today. Whereas you were within a shared value, you were sort of taking on. So you could have done your sort of chart, in fact, you sort of did it, but you're pros and cons. But outside of the community, you have to be very careful because they don't understand. So there's sort of the inside the group, the myth busting can be very effective. And outside, where it has to be very much from short niche, sort of public, not taken as a phone approach. One thing that even rather interesting and trivial scientific cases that got outside the scientific community created story. Lucio was not a plan, which is created this great story. He didn't really show the plan. So let's take defensive myth busting like your talk today. You really give it credit.
Right. Okay. I appreciate your point that the dynamics of the group are important. There is, you know, there's all kinds of, you know, groups like psychology research into like group dynamics and how we come to, you know, generate any kind of shared understanding. And it usually starts with something like there needs to be some shared assumptions that we can build upon. That's how we build trust. It's how we build understanding. And our meeting makers would agree with that. So the infographics that I started with, the myth-busting infographics, were often used as a way to, were pointed at the people who don't believe it, right? So it was always the people who might just be uninformed, so maybe they're receptive to scientific information, and that might be successful. But there was often the belief that if you flooded the internet with it, with these infographics, the people that didn't believe it would eventually come around to believing it. There's all kinds of research into it. They think it's just through frequent exposure, it's somehow going to work that way. And there's enough, and against that view, there's enough sociological research into resistance to all kinds of official claims. I'm of course familiar with the vaccine hesitancy research, which it doesn't matter how many times you say it, and it certainly doesn't matter if 97 out of 100 scientists apparently believe this. If people don't trust the science, don't trust the framework that brings the science to us, they're never going to believe any kind of claim that is made, and they will, if anything, move the goalpost, as I said earlier, and say, well, this is probably a lie, this is a conspiracy or something like that. So we need to begin with something a little more shared. And I think that was your point, that there are, in those contexts, a little bit of myth busting might actually be helpful. So I appreciate that point. Thank you.
So I think we're supposed to stop at 5, is that right? For ALS talks? I don't want to suppress discussion here, although we could do it at the reception. So before we clap for Maya, I have the duty of presenting, this looks different, doesn't it? A sensible, carryable center umbrella, which is we'd like to give you to take home.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everybody is invited to attend the reception and let Maya have something to eat and drink, maybe before you barrage her with more questions. Oh, I'm not going to stop.
Okay, we can still talk.
We can still
Thank
talk.
you.
Thank you, Maya.